That's right. That's right.
The cappuccino's kicking in, and it's all about that bass. That's excellent.
Let's jump into this, you guys. It is all about that bass. Obviously, it's not all about it, but it is a big piece to it. And it's something that's frankly a little misunderstood sometimes.
So you're right, Brett. Bass is important, and not just because the song says so. Interestingly enough, there's some statistics that show that the perception of quality of bass dominates many, many other things. Let me go to a share screen over here. You know, you go back to the mid '90s, and you go, "Wow, bass is getting complicated." And I got very interested in, like, how do we manage this? How do we make sure that any sound system that's put into a room has the best capability in bass, and coined the term bass management back then. And it's still an issue. It's still challenging. It's a complex puzzle is what I like to say. Now, bass matters. Audiences love it. They look at the reaction from people on a demo that doesn't have good bass. And then, you know, if you could magically switch it on, you'd see everybody smiles go up. Everybody just, you know, gets into it. It's fun. Some people love it so much that they actually tattoo it on their arm. That's a bass clef. I mean, that's more commitment than I'm really willing to do it, to, you know, tattoo it on there. But a gentleman by the name of Sean Olive, who is a very, very well-known audio engineer in our midst, has coined that about 35% of sensor quality comes from the range from 20 hertz up to about 60, 70 hertz. That's only 2 octaves out of the 10 that you hear. And that dominates your sense of this sounds good. Yeah. And so if you want return on investment, if you're on this webinar because you're a salesperson and you want to get great return on investment on what you're selling to people, improve the bass. And by improve the bass, we're going to talk about that. What does that mean? So low bass is tactile. There's a frequency below which it stops being heard as tones and it starts to be felt. And that's where people go, oh, how cool. I feel like I'm being reached out to by the sound system and it's immersing me in because I'm vibrating. It's very cool, but it's hard to do. It's hard to get right. You got to manage it. And what do I mean by managing? We're going to talk about that. So on the agenda for today is low frequencies are important for music and for film, and they are challenging in the spaces in which we work, in the residential space, you know, rooms between 200 square feet, that's 20 square meters, up to about 700 or 800 square feet, that's 70 or 80 square meters. The way the waves propagate and bounce around creates some serious challenges because of what's called standing waves. And the joke I say is, standing waves are going to be in the room whether you stand or sit, by the way. You know, I've said people say, well, like, what if I sit down? Do I hear them? It's like, well, it depends on the standing wave. There are headroom issues. You need to be able to play high sound pressure levels in bass for it to all work out. And there's a lot of solutions, but they're often ignored. I know I've been talking about this, like I said, for 30 years. There's other scientists that have been talking about it for 20, 25 years. And I keep going into these environments where really, ultimately, no attention was paid to the issues. And that's too bad, but that's why we're here. There's a lot of legends out there about what bass is and what is not. I hear all kinds of, oh, blah, 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 this is what happens. And some of it, it's like, well, listen to the result. Are you good with this? No?
Sure.
Okay, let's talk about how to solve it.
You know, one of the things that I see a lot of times, Anthony, and especially in the consumer forums, you know, subwoofers just sitting up front, just to sit up front, right? I've even seen, you know, multiple subwoofers sitting up front. Does that always work? Is bass omnidirectional? You know, you hear a lot of stuff about where to position speakers, but what about positioning subwoofers?
One of the legends, like you said, is bass is non-directional, so you can put the subwoofer wherever you want. Another legend is, no, the subwoofers need to be up front with the speaker so that the sound, you know, goes with the waves hit you and they percuss you. Well, that's not exactly how sound works. So legend number one, bass is non-directional. So you can put the subwoofer anywhere, really. Is that true? So here's an example of a room set up for just barely 5.1 channel, three fronts, side left, side right, and a subwoofer stuck, you know, on the right wall by where it could fit. That's an example. So is that okay? Maybe yes, maybe no. So let's look at the effects of subwoofer location. I'm going to show you some measurements done in a room where I move the subwoofer around, measure the result, move the subwoofer to a different place, measure the result, and let's look at what happens in the range from 20 to 200 hertz. That's the range that we're here to discuss. So first off, I start with a good subwoofer. This particular one is from several years ago that David Nelson from Triad loaned me for an evaluation. It's a very good subwoofer. And here's its impulse response. It was measured. This is a measurement in the near field, is the actual picture. Take a good measurement microphone, stick it in the cone, put it outside, and here is what this subwoofer can do without any room around it, right? So this is what the unit can put out in the room. Craig Todd just asked, like, how do I measure this? I happen to measure this with Room EQ Wizard using the impulse response scheme. You could also measure it using their pseudo-random pink noise scheme. Make sure you go to at least 12th octave resolution or 24th octave. Doesn't really matter. Using the impulse response scheme gives you other data than just the amplitude response, so that's a good thing to do. Thank you, Craig, for that question. And so this I'm measuring near field. The results that are coming up were also measured using Room EQ Wizard, REW, using the impulse response scheme. That works. Takes a little bit of learning. Go through the tutorials. So this is a good subwoofer. What I mean by good is it starts well at 20 hertz, and the response is within a dB or two all the way up to 200 hertz. Okay, good subwoofer. Now let's take that same subwoofer, put it into the room at a location near where the left speaker would be. Or you would get the same thing if you had a full range left speaker. Let's take a look at the result. First of all, here's a picture of said room. This is not theoretical. These are actual real measurements. There's that same microphone. There's that same subwoofer sitting at where you would normally plop a left speaker. And this particular room I'm using is 5 meters by 4 by 2.75 more or less, which is about 16 by 13 by 9. Not a very big room. Now, this is the measurement you get at this microphone location that is more or less where you would want to put a seat from that subwoofer at the left location. This is what the room has done to the subwoofer. Same everything else, same cables, same dolly, same wire. Everything else is the same. We went from outside the room with the microphone in the cone, measuring just the subwoofer, to put the subwoofer in the room and measure it. There are 38 decibels of error between this peak and that null in this room. That's what the room just did to this poor subwoofer. That's bad. Remember, this is what the near field was. This is what the subwoofer is putting into the room. This is what the subwoofer plus the room did. That's a problem, right? What this means is at this particular location, you're not going to hear any 52 hertz. Whatever is playing in that region is ducked down. There's going to be a peak somewhere around 38 hertz, and then it's going to go up and down and up and down and up and down. Guess what's right around 52 hertz? Any drummers in the room? A nice big kick drum, rock and roll kick drum, typically a 21, 22 inch, 24 inch kick drum is right around that region. So if you're listening to solid rock and roll, rather than get that thump you get from All About That Bass, you're just hearing the mallet. There's no good bass. Sure. So fine. So that's that one location. Let's move the subwoofer to a different location. If you say you can put a subwoofer anywhere, let's see what happens if we put it somewhere else. So there's a picture. There's a picture. Now subwoofers move to the center location. The legend says you can put it anywhere. Well, here's the result. We've got now a less bad error. It's 28 dB instead of 38 dB, but it's equally bad between this peak and this dip. That dip has moved slightly to a different frequency. Still not good. So let's see if we move it to the right location. Here's the result of that response at that right location. So now the error is a whole lot less bad. It's gooder. It's less badder. It's still not great. It's 20 dB difference between this peak and this dip. Notice that everything has changed in the frequency ranges here. We now have this peak. This peak was there before, but now there's a dip of 30. It's all different. If I overlay those three, these are just three locations. I just chose those as what you would do if you either had a full range speaker or put a subwoofer right by that speaker, or like some people think, you put a subwoofer with each speaker. This is the difference. Notice, interestingly enough, it's all bad. Interestingly enough, the room is symmetrical. It's a rectangular room, and the left and right don't look anything like each other. Right? Excuse me, this is the right. The right is in red. Yep. The left is in blue. They look totally different. Yeah. Now, we could just continue just for fun and look at what would happen at the side left and side right location. So if you put the subwoofers on the side wall, this is what they look like. There's still errors of 20 dB, still bad. It's still not working for us. You got to have decent bass, or else you just don't enjoy the sound. Do we agree we have a problem? So this is an example of one room. If we had 6 hours, I could show you tons and tons and tons of data on many, 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 many rooms I've been in and out in the last 30 years. I've measured about 1,000 different rooms, residential size spaces, that all have worse or better problems than this, but we have a problem. And what I found over the years is you got to manage it. And the management is actually a 6-step process. You can do just one of the 6 steps and it makes things better, but you really need to do 6 different things to get to a point where that bass is tight and clean and even and doesn't change too much from seat to seat. And, it's confusing.
I find it interesting that when we look at that left and the right speaker, you would assume, hey, they're on opposite sides. If it's a relatively symmetrical room, wouldn't they at least be off the same amount? And they're not.
I'm really a fan of trying to get to the bottom line of this. So I am going to share my screen again. It's the root cause is generally, it's not the only thing, but is standing wave resonances. That's what messes us up in these rooms. So what does that look like? When you're getting down into the bass region and the waves are about the same size as the room, or the same size as the room, where here I'm showing a representation of wave that's zigzagging around. I'm just trying to show that it's the peak dip range of a sound pressure wave just fits in the room. But also when half of a wave fits in a room, a 1.5 wave, when there's like integrals of that, you got a problem. Standing waves happen when room dimension is equal to sound wavelength, or when you're looking at the length, width, and height, the 3 room dimensions are equal to that, or 0.5, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3 times the wavelength. And that causes a resonance because the wave right at that point is happy to bounce back and forth and stay. Just like the string on a guitar, when you pluck it, it's just happy to ring at one note. And that means there's some frequencies that are louder than others. So you end up with an uneven frequency response. You end up with poor bass impact. Like I showed you in the result of that, you're missing 52 hertz. You can't get good rock and roll kick drum if you don't have that frequency. Also, you get a different bass at other seats. I have a ton more data on this room showing the results at different locations. So not only as we move subwoofer locations around, does the bass result change, but given one subwoofer location, you can move around in the room and the bass result changes. So different basses at every seat is a bad news. And usually the biggest problems in residential spaces are between 30 and 150 hertz, at least where construction is made out of sheetrock on studs or gypsum board on studs, because below that, they start to absorb or transmit bass. So how do those resonances happen? So I've been kind of scratching my head for years for like how to represent this. I always like to graphically try to show what happens. Let's look at this. Imagine this is a room from front to back, and you're sending a wave in a room that is at the first resonance, in which the full wave is twice as long as the room. Imagine you have a room in which the whole back is open. You got giant patio doors. If there's no wall, there's no reflection, the wave just goes right out. Now, take that same room, close the big patio doors in the back, and the sound bounces back, right? So instead of going out, it just reflects back. So who cares? Is that what causes it? Well, not so simple. Really, sound pressure that you're hearing is a change, or sound that you're hearing is a change of pressure over time, right? If you just put pressure in your ear, you feel the pressure, but there's no sound. Where you hear sound is when the pressure goes from rest to positive pressure, back to negative pressure, back to rest, and back and forth and back and forth. Incidentally, it mainly fires on the outgoing pressure, not on the in one. The auditory system is a half-wave rectifier, if you want to think of it that way. So what I'm going to represent now on the left over here is really the sound propagated by maybe a subwoofer, which is going from high pressure to low pressure to high pressure. And at every pressure point, it's propagating through the room. So check this out. This is later in time, later in time, later in time, later in time. Just focus on the left side of the room. So this is pressure going up and down, which is the woofer pushing air, coming back to rest, pulling air, pushing air, rest being right in the middle. Okay. So this is pressure up, neutral, down. Now, look at how it propagates through the room. This one at high pressure goes through and bounces back. This one at a cone a little bit less far propagates through the room and comes back, propagates through the room and comes back, propagates through the room, etc. If you go to the opposite side of the room, you're hearing the same sound. It actually happens to be out of polarity. We'll get back to that later. But you're hearing the pressure going up and down. Or your pressure is going up and down, which means you're hearing it. Your brain's going, hey, something just happened at my ear. What happens if you're in the middle of the room? If you look at this, there's been no change of pressure over time. Change of pressure over time, no change of pressure over time, change of pressure. This is an effect of the standing wave, which is on either side of the room, you've got sound. And in the middle of the room, in this case, when the wave is twice as long as the room, there's no sound. 0 or 40 dB down, which is 1% of where you started. If you take the same wave and you put it in a room that's different, or you change the wave to where that point that originally was at the boundary is now at a different place, it bounces back. It doesn't overlap. There are no standing waves. So we can represent the standing wave or the region of sound from standing waves this way. I'm going to keep talking about this first one, what's called the first harmonic, which the wave is twice as long as the room. You can represent that the resulting sound level looks like this. This is not a wave. This is just a map of it's loud, and right here it's quiet. Okay, this kind of gull wing look just represents that right here it's quiet, here it's loud, here it's loud. This is the actual wave that you're sending into the room. So I only talked about the first resonance, the one in which the wave is twice as long as the room. The second one, which is when the wave entirely fits in the room, you end up with a null at 1/4 and a null at 3/4. Okay, so everything I just talked about before, where there's a null in the middle, you double the frequency, and now in the middle, it's nice and loud. At the wall on one side and the other, it's nice and loud, but 1/4 of the way into the room and 3/4 of the way into the room, there's no sound, or there's a reduction of sound level. At the third harmonic, in which you can fit 1.5 waves in the room, there's a null at 1/6, a peak at 2/6, which is a third, a null at 3/6, which is also 1/2, a peak at 4/6, which is 2/3, and then a null at 5/6. And guess what happens in the fourth harmonic when you can actually fit 2 waves in there? There's a series at the 8ths, 1/8, 2/8, 3/8, etc. So this is a really simple way to look at how these resonances happen.
Sure, but it's telling me I can't get a seat anywhere, right? Because I can't put it in the middle, I can't put it in the quarters, I can't put it in the thirds, and I can't put it in the 8ths.
Grasshopper. We're going to talk later about seats. There is a place where you can kind of snake your way around there. I'll give you a hint. Somewhere right around here. You're neither at the nulls or peaks of that, neither peaks of that. You can actually cheat it. And that's a really important thing. One of those steps in your toolkit for getting around standing waves is don't sit at a place where you hit. So don't sit in the middle of the room. Don't sit at a quarter. That's what works. Here's another representation of the same thing. I'm not saying anything new. I'm just showing it differently. This is a room seen from above with a really nice loudspeaker that consists of a red box with a horn in front of it.
Good looking speaker.
Nice, huh? Hey, Brett, you and I should go in business of making those.
That's right.
So, and what I'm representing over here is the second harmonic standing wave, just seen from the top, the what's called the axial length standing wave. It's loud here. It's loud here, it's loud here, it's quiet here, it's quiet here. Now, Murphy's first law of acoustics says that wherever you want to put the couch, it's going to be right at a null of a second harmonic.
Of course.
And if you move the couch, the null moves with you. No, it happens because this is 3/4 of the way back in the room. A lot of people, naturally want to sit somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 back in the room. And that's right where there's no bass at the second harmonic. Now, another effect of the standing waves. So here, this effect is just that there's errors in frequency response. There's frequencies where there's nulls and peaks. Another effect is that there's also resonances. Over this frequency is a resonance. At this particular frequency, the sound is going to hang. And this is an example of a room decay in what's called a waterfall plot done years ago. I should redo this, but this is showing that there's a long decay series right around here. The sound at other frequencies, this is showing your progression over time. This is actually using TEF. Man, that pushes us back a few years. This is 12 milliseconds after the beginning of time, which is the time it took for the sound to travel 12 feet to the microphone. And this is 800 milliseconds, which is close to the time it takes for the sound to fully die out. And you look down here at lower frequencies, the sound passes the microphone a few times and then dies out kind of as an even fall off. And in this particular room at 52 hertz, the sound is just hanging. It's louder and it hangs a long time. So some notes are totally gone. Other notes just hang a long time. So rather than get nice, tight, punchy, even bass, you end up with some notes that just go and other ones that are not there at all. That's bad bass. Can't do that. So that's how this, that's basically how this happens in these rooms. So the main effects of audibility of standing wave are errors in frequency response, and then the sense of resonance where some notes are just hanging and rather than sound even, it's just kind of mushy. I was joking about how I had this old plot. Well, I have a newer plot too. This is, interestingly enough, this is that same room I was bringing up earlier, what we call the blue room here. And that's the first subwoofer one at mic 1, and it shows a resonance at 72 hertz. So same thing here. When you look at a waterfall plot, these all come from Room EQ Wizard. So I want to give them a plug. So the guys at Room EQ Wizard designed an absolutely stellar, unbelievably good analysis tool. It takes some time to learn it. There's great tutorials. It's a free download, but please send them $50 or $100 for the amazing work that they've done to program this. It's better than anything else I bought for tens of thousands of dollars before. It's unbelievable. One of the things you can do is you can do what's called an impulse response sweep and then tell it, show me how all of the sounds decay, all the frequencies decay over time. And in this particular room, when you look at the range from 600 or 700 hertz on up to 10 kilohertz, you can see that waterfall, how those frequencies decay is really even, which is a sign of good mids and highs. And you can see that at if you use that single subwoofer at that location, you see how this ridge just hangs forever here? While everything else is gone by about 300 milliseconds, this takes a good 800 milliseconds before it's gone. That means it's hanging for a long time. So that's an example of tools you can get today that can tell you all that for free. You do need to get a microphone for 70 or 80 bucks. Come on, what's that? So solutions. There are solutions. Good news is you're not stuck with it. You don't have to live with it. And what I'm going to do on this series here is give you solutions, not necessarily in order of design, but in order of like, okay, I have my room. What can I do? I don't want to rebuild a room. I have my room. What can I do? Well, one of the things you can do is pick the right subwoofer or place it at the right location or do something so that you find the place that is least bad. You may remember from all of my measurements, there was one that was horrible at 38 dB error. Mm-hmm. There was one that was less bad at 20 dB. Is there if I kept moving that subwoofer around, is there a location for a single seat listener environment where it's within plus and minus 5 dB? That's not bad. There is. You can. Of course, it's going to be right in the middle of a door. It's going to be right, totally impractical. But there is a location, or there's other things you can do. So first thing, what I'm going to talk about here, which is either free because you just move the subwoofer around, or maybe more expensive because you got to buy more subwoofers. What can you do with placing subwoofers? So first of all, in choosing your subwoofers, let's imagine you've got a room. It may have a problem, may not have a problem. You got to pick subwoofers. You got to figure out what's the bandwidth you're trying to get out of the subwoofer and how loud do you want to play. Some people out there get subwoofers that are way too big for the room. They put 4 24-inch subwoofers in a room that's only 300 square feet, and that's ridiculous. Yeah, you got a lot of bass, but it's pointless. And other people put these little bitty subwoofers that can barely get up to 95 dB. You need to be able to play 110 dB in room. We'll talk about that later. So you got to pick the right subwoofers based on the dimensions and character of your room. So ideally you want to play to 110, maybe 115 dB in room. If you're going to use quote unquote full range loudspeakers and say, I don't need subwoofers, beware, your speakers are going to end up being really big. There are people who make speakers with a 15-inch woofer in it with plenty of power to get there, but it takes a lot of coning. You really do need a subwoofer. And if you're going to do a subwoofer, multiple subwoofers, I would prefer to have 2 smaller subwoofers than 1 big one. Better yet, 4 maybe even smaller subwoofers rather than one that you can hide away in a room. There's a guy called Todd Welty and his buddy Al. No, this is scientific annotation for Ed Al and others that have written several publications. Please read them. Look up his name. At the time he was doing a lot of this research, he was working for Harman International's research group. But very smart guy. I call him the doctor of subwoofer. He knows more about bass and bass propagation in room than just about anybody else in the world. So my first like really big picture is, if you just retain one thing from today, is it is better to have multiple subwoofers, preferably for all playing the same sound, maybe adjusted differently slightly, but they're receiving the same signal in mono, not stereo, not left and right, not front and back, but in these smaller rooms in mono. So Todd wrote this paper back in 2003. So this is 20-year-old information that did all this analysis and measurement on, the paper is called The Subwoofers, How Many is Enough, or something like that. It was presented at the Audio Engineering Society. I think it was in Munich, Amsterdam, I forget, somewhere in Europe. I happened to be there and sat through the paper. I was like, holy moly, he's got it. Did all of this math and analysis and measurements, and proposed a number of placements for subwoofers based on a bunch of different factors, which is evenness of frequency response, reduction of variation from seat to seat, overall gain. So when you drive the subwoofer with a certain voltage, what does this layout give you in terms of sound pressure level? Because some of them interact better with rooms than others. And he produced this really interesting AES paper. The paper itself is scientific. It's a little hard to read, but there is a distillate of it available, or was available, on the Harman website as a kind of a simplified version. Please do pick it up. Todd Welty. So one of the things he said is that among the best solutions is to put 4 subwoofers in a room at the quarter points. Impractical? Yes, unless you think of the ceiling. You can put 4 10-inch subwoofers hanging from or built into the ceiling of a room, as long as you worry about the structural issues and the weight bearing and all of that, and at the quarter points, and you'll get really good bass. So legend number 2 is subwoofers need to be on the floor. No, bass is propagating evenly in the room in all directions. It doesn't know that it's on the floor, on the front and the back. What matters more is the interaction between the subwoofer and the rooms and the standing waves. And this is a great solution. Okay. And I've done this a number of times. Another solution that works well in terms of smoothness and all of that is 4 subwoofers at the midpoints of the room. And that works. One of the things about this is it's not particularly a high sound pressure level solution. It's not highly efficient, but produces very good sound. Another solution that he's proposed is 4 in the 4 corners. It's a little less good than this, but you get at least 3 dB more sound pressure level, sometimes 4 or 5 dB more by corner loading the group of all 4 of them, and that's worth it because you want headroom in the bass. If you can't put 4 subwoofers, just put 2, either left and right of the middle of the wall, or hey, I'm missing that slide, or middle of the back, middle of the front. They fix different standing waves, but it's better than a single subwoofer.
Sure.
All right, so solution 1 that is either free if you haven't yet bought your subwoofers, or maybe is a little expensive because now you got to go buy a second subwoofer, and very good subwoofers are available for not that much money these days, is propagate them, have more of them so that they actually evenly pressure the room. So let's take a look at that in this room we're talking about. I'm going to keep going back to what we call the blue room because it's painted with sort of a gray blue. Actually, it was supposed to be a neutral gray, and the paint mix was wrong, and it ended up with a slight tint of blue. We painted it, and it's like, oh, close enough. It's not too far off into the blue.
I'll send you some samples, Anthony.
Yeah, get me some samples. I should have gotten the Munsell paint and be done with it. So remember, this is what we had from the single subwoofer locations, left, center, and right. And this is what we get now from 4 subwoofers in the 4 corners of the room. These are measured. This is a little more complicated of a graph. It's actually measured at 4 locations, but the average of those 4 locations is actually the red line. So if you follow this red line, that shows us an average of the room by just, instead of using 1 subwoofer at 1 location, you use 4 smaller subwoofers. You still need them to extend down to 20 hertz. And there's people who make smaller subwoofers that play less loud and go down to 20 hertz. And look at how much better this is. At multiple locations in the room, you get a good solid consistency between 20 hertz and 60 hertz. Then there's some variation up here, the average being this red line. Now we're going to talk about this variation later. This is way more better. 12 dB peak to peak errors without EQ. This is unequalized. This is just 4 decent small subwoofers.
Stick them in the corners, stick them on the sides, 4 subs. This is what you're getting. That's amazing, actually.
So first strategy is subwoofer placement. 4 is best, 2 is okay. Experiment a lot. Sometimes moving them a little bit. You'd be amazed by just just moving the subwoofer 4 inches, what effect that's going to have in contradicting the standing wave and getting you much better results. And what I like to say is expect drastic improvements. This is not subtle. These are big changes. Going from 38 dB errors to just 12 is highly audible and way more audible than just changing the speaker wires that go to the subwoofer, which some people try to fix things, or they put them on little feet to help improve the thing. No, dude, just understand the standing wave interactions, and that's what's really going to make a huge difference.
Well, especially as you get in, here we've got, although you have 3 seats there, but, when you get into theaters that have, 3 seats, 6 seats, multiple rows, you're really looking at a spot where, it's not 2-channel where you're listening at one key spot. So yeah, if I can fix at multiple locations by using multiple subs, and help improve that sound and reduce that big 30 dB, drop down to 12, that means I'm going to get more even sound, throughout the room, right? Which is what I want. If I'm putting
Right.
that many seats in a room, I expect them to be good.
So that's one thing that home theater or home cinema has introduced, is the fact that it's not a solitary experience. So a lot of audiophiles are like, dude, I want to get away from everybody. I'm going to sit here with my glass of cognac or wine or juice, and I'm just going to listen to music at this location. You can find a good subwoofer place where the sound is decent. To find it, don't just listen. I have people that sit around and they're listening to program material. Dude, get Room EQ Wizard. It's cheap. Get a microphone, $70. Put it at your location. Feed the subwoofer. If you want, with going back to what Craig Todd asked a little while ago, just play what's called pink. There you go. Simple. Play what's called pink PN in Room EQ Wizard, which is a pseudo-random sequence. You can choose the number of points. I use a 64th. It's basically playing 64,000 different frequencies in a cycle, and you can actually hear the cycle. It kind of goes, and the measurement device is looking for that cycle, and it very quickly gives you data way faster than a regular RTA. And just put the subwoofer on a dolly, move it around while looking at the screen of your laptop, computer, whatever you're using, and you'll find a place where it's less bad. That's if it's one seating location, solitary experience. And if the listeners here, that's all they care about, done. But you're bringing up a good point, which is a lot of folks like home cinema, or if you like music, you may want to have 2 or 3 buddies over listening to music together, and you want everybody to have good bass. So don't just measure one point, you got to measure multiple points. And when you start to measure multiple points, you will find it's really difficult to get them to all be good with a single subwoofer. That's where 2 subwoofers or 4 subwoofers comes in to smooth out the response. I'll show you later my kind of simple science explanation of how that works, but just trust me for now. Robert Bush says, put sub on a dolly and move and groove. Why put it on a dolly?
Because subwoofers are heavy.
Because they're heavy. I don't want anybody to come back to me and go, I broke my back moving my subwoofer around.
That's right. 4 inches.
So they're heavy, but also by putting it on a dolly and moving it slowly and observing the results on your screen of the response of that, you can have a continuum as opposed to pick up and move where you have this big chunk transition. So just moving it evenly is a way to do it. Get a little plant dolly with decent wheels that can support your 300-pound subwoofer. You'll be fine. So Frank Maroney asks a good question, is why do theaters like the Film Academy follow the 4 subwoofer rules and only have them at the front? So that's a really cool question I'm going to get into actually right now by corollary. The short answer is their standing waves in these big rooms are at 5 hertz, 5 to 8, 10 hertz, because the rooms are big enough that the standing waves, instead of being in the 50, 60, 70 hertz region, they're way lower in frequency. So by the time, Frank, you're listening to the bass you're putting in, the room is no longer resonant. It's way beyond what's known in acoustics as its modal region. It's a point at which you're past where the room has standing waves. So I mentioned this thing about low frequency, below the modal region.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, there's a lot of interest in what's called infrasonics now in home cinema. And what is that? I mean, it's all over the forums. It was all over at the CEDIA Expo.
Mm-hmm.
What is that? And what was infrasonic? So what does the language mean? I'll just give you my interpretation. First of all, to me, a subwoofer is a device that was used, when the term was first coined by the likes of MNK and Kinergetics, and there's other people who started making those. This was a device that was meant to play below where the woofer of a typical speaker in that era cut off, which is about 40 hertz. If you go back, even today, people who claim, oh, this is my full range speaker, they basically play down to 40 or 50 hertz and then poop out. They may play lower at low levels, but at high levels, you're just overdriving the woofers. So the idea of a subwoofer is it's really playing the bottom octave from 20 hertz to 40 hertz, below the region at which a woofer could play. Now, it also turns out that somewhere around 40 hertz, your perception of sound goes from a tone where you hear ooh as you go down, you hear the tone ooh, and at some point you stop hearing it as a tone and it starts to be felt as a vibration. So this tendency was also somewhere around 30 to 40 hertz, it starts to be more tactile than tonal. And so that's kind of like the world of subs. Now, most subwoofers typically play from down to 20 hertz. Sometimes they play all the way up to 200, but really they basically poop out at 20. And does sound go below 20 hertz? Well, it does. Big pipe organs play all the way down to 16 hertz, and they're not heard as a tone. It's more like a vibration. And there's stuff in film soundtracks and in music that is way down in there. And there's folks out there that are measuring it. Whether we're supposed to be heard or not is unclear. And Frank may be able to chime in and go, yeah, there's stuff down there in this film soundtrack I did that's in the 12 hertz. I never intended it. It's just a result of signal processing or whatever. But whether it's meant to be heard, it's nice to be able to play all the way down to 10 hertz, 12 hertz. So anything that's there, you can play back. Now, there's good news. The bad news would be, holy moly, I need to have 4 subwoofers that all play down to 10 hertz. Those are monsters. These are like 24-inch drivers or 32-inch drivers. Well, not everything I'm talking today is doom and gloom. If you want to play all the way down to 12 hertz, 13 hertz, whatever frequency you're trying to get to, one approach is to put 4 Mahanga subwoofers in the room. And, I make subwoofers. I'd love to sell you our 21-inch. You don't need it. What you need is 4 subwoofers in the corners that are tackling the region of bass that is what is known in acoustics as modal, the region where there are standing waves. And that's typically, in most rooms, about 40 hertz up to about 80 or 90 hertz. So new thinking. There is a region of bass from about 80 hertz down to 40 hertz, 30 to 40 hertz, where the room has standing waves. That's where you want to propagate these 4 subwoofers and do something to tune them, which we'll talk about later. Below that, you don't need to worry about it again because the room you're now below the resonance frequency of the room. And you can just have 1 infrasonic subwoofer or 2, whatever it takes to drive enough sound pressure level. This is just horsepower. So a small room, you could probably get somebody's, actually, I'll mention them, SVS. I'm jealous of those guys. They make incredibly good subwoofers for the money. There's other people who do too, but they make some 16-inch subwoofers that play well down into 15 hertz for not that much money. And they play loud. So if you have a room that's around 300 square feet, 30 square meters, you could probably get away with one of their Mahanga 16-inch subwoofers to drive the infrasonic region. Okay, a single one. Don't just do a single one for everything, but find, then you have to cross it over, which is a discussion for a later time, but you could do that. Or 2 if you have a bigger room or a bigger subwoofer or whatever. I'm actually tempted to go back to this slide. You remember this? What in this room is the modal region? Well, you see down here, this here looks kind of like what the anechoic response looked like. So this particular room below 30 hertz just supported the anechoic character of the subwoofer, and problems really started at about 35 hertz. And from here up to here, you're mainly dealing with standing waves, the modal region of the room. So this room, I would say from 35 hertz to about 80, 75 or 80 hertz, this particular room had standing wave issues. Above that, don't worry about standing waves. There's other problems. Below that, don't worry about standing waves. So a thinking in the world of infrasonics is have 4 subwoofers that carry the 30 or 40 hertz up to 80 or 90 hertz, wherever you're crossing to your speakers. And then below that, a single or 2 or 3 or however many it takes to get the sound pressure level where you don't need to worry about standing wave character. So if you remember those diagrams I showed before that showed the first resonance is where a half a wave fits in the room, right? And in the case of, I'm just going to cite an example of a 20-foot room, 6 meters. That first frequency is 25 hertz. Okay. Below that, there are no standing waves. In fact, in a typical U.S. construction, U.S., Australia, places where they build with gypsum board on studs, below 30 or 35 hertz, the walls are flexing, so they're not really even keeping the standing wave. So when there's no more standing waves, you don't need to worry about it. And this is, I guess I'm going to share screen again. This is kind of how the placement and interaction in the room works, again, in sort of a simple diagrammatic form. How does this work? What does this business do? So driving the standing waves. So the worst thing you could do is put one subwoofer in the corner on the front wall, because that's driving the standing waves very efficiently, which is what you don't want. Efficiency means that some notes are really loud, but other notes are really quiet. So you don't really want that. If you move the subwoofer away from there, you can improve the response by moving it. So that whole business I talked about earlier, that you can put a dolly on a subwoofer and observe its result, that's just noticing the result. Here's how that works. So here's an interesting piece of info. Remember this representation of the first harmonic, this is a wave in which half a wave fits in the room. The resulting sound pressure, which is what I'm showing here, looks like this. It's loud here, it's loud there, and it's totally quiet here. Interesting thing is this is called a node, and it is like the pivot of a seesaw. The sound is actually going like this. Interestingly enough, at that null, there's no sound. On one side of the null, when the pressure is positive, it's negative on the other side. So it actually flips polarity on either side. And it's kind of cool. You can actually hear this. You won't hear this at 25 hertz, but if you have a standing wave at like 80 or 90 hertz, and you put yourself right in the null, on one side of the null, you're going to hear 80 hertz. On the other side, you're going to hear 80 hertz. And right at the null, you're going to get that sense that it's out of phase, that sense that you get from two speakers in stereo that one is connected backwards. It's kind of this funny head cold sense, like, wow, weird. That's a true standing wave. So the acoustic polarity changes around the null. So who cares? Well, imagine you put a subwoofer here. That subwoofer is going to drive the standing wave. There's going to be, when there is positive pressure here, there's negative pressure here. There's a null here. Don't sit here. But check out what happens when you put the subwoofer right at the null. The subwoofer wants to, the standing wave wants to go like this. The pressure polarity wants to go like this. Get around my microphone. But the subwoofer wants to push it up and down evenly because the cone's right in the null. So instead of the standing wave developing naturally, you've now contradicted because you want it to do this. And so instead of getting this big standing wave gain at one frequency and then a null at another frequency, you've just tamed it by moving the subwoofer into the null. And that's what's happening when you're listening to the standing waves and you're moving the subwoofer on a dolly. Sure. Actually, if somebody could build a motorized dolly with like big enough engines with a remote control that you could just sit at your seat and listen while you move the thing around, that would be really, really cool. But this guy, Grant Imahara, who used to work for me at THX, went on to ILM and then to Mythbusters, and he loved remote control things. And he was going to build me one of these like ballsy ones that you could put a 200-pound subwoofer on it and move it around. Never got around to it. But so this is what happens. So the subwoofer drives the pressure minimum. When you are at frequencies that are below that region, you can move the subwoofer as you want, and it's not going to change things very much. So here you get less resonance. It's cool. Going back to an actual room, this is an example of you sitting on your chair wearing a red hat and a blue suit and some red socks. It's a very good look on you.
Like I often do. Yep.
Where if you'd put the subwoofer on the front wall, and let's say the room is 20 feet long and you're actually playing 50 hertz in this case, you're going to get this kind of profile to the sound pressure. So loud here, loud here, loud here, and no sound at 50 hertz where you're sitting. Not good, right? So you should have like a frown, like that's not good. Subwoofers over here, if you could measure the pressure polarity, you would see it's positive here, it's negative there, it's positive there. Or if you get up and turn right at 50 hertz, you may be able to hear it. You turn your head sideways, you'll hear that it's out of phase. You move the subwoofer from that location, you bring it into the room to drive one of the nulls, the resulting errors go down. There's still some error, it's still not great, but it's less bad, right? So instead of moving the subwoofer, what happens if you put two of them? So if you put two subwoofers on either side of the null and you connect them together, the standing wave wants to do this, but you got two subwoofers that are doing this to the standing wave. Now what happens is less standing wave. So that's a simple view of what happens when you go from a single subwoofer to dual subwoofers in the front and back, in the left and right, is you're canceling at least the odd order of standing waves, which is the first, the third, and the fifth. Same thing, if I go back to a drawing of the room, that's two subwoofers, one here and one there, and you're getting rid of what would be, in this case, the second harmonic. So if I propagate that across the four harmonics that we care about, this is the pressure polarity at the first harmonic. That's the one where the wave is twice as long as the room. Pressure polarity of the second harmonic, that's when the wave is the same length of the room. It goes plus, minus, plus. This is the third harmonic when the wave is 1.5, plus, minus, plus, minus. Fourth harmonic when two waves fit in the room, plus, minus, plus, minus, plus, minus. So if you use a single subwoofer and you put it in the corner, it's going to drive those harmonics. If you can move it over, you'll reduce it. And here's a range of all the different harmonics you could consider putting a subwoofer at to reduce the effects. Or you can just use multiples. So check it out. If we put two subwoofers in the room, we get rid of that, what I had shown before, as the first harmonic, and we get rid of the third harmonic, but the second harmonic is still there, right? Because this is plus, minus, plus. Hey, at least you've reduced some of the standing waves. There's one left out of 3 or 4. That's when the two other subwoofers come in handy, right? If you can put them in another location of the room where they're canceling that, you're reducing that effect. And that's what that whole thing is about, placing multiple subwoofers in the room. Or same thing with speakers. If the room is small enough, the standing waves go up to 100, 120 hertz. And if you place the speakers correctly in the room, you will reduce the efficiency of the standing waves. Bottom line is move the subwoofers away from just a single corner from the front wall. Try playing them around, multiply them to 2 or 3 or 4. I haven't found that 5 is a whole lot better. At some point, the improvement is pretty benign. And actually, that's what Todd found in both his theoretical research and his practical research back 20 years ago. So typically 4 subwoofers in the 4 corners or other places is a great way to improve things.
And then I'm guessing past that is really just SPL levels, right? So if you're putting in either bigger drivers or more drivers, you're not improving standing waves, you're just increasing SPL at that point.
Correct. That's where it gets better. So in the end, though, to get that thump, or if in a movie soundtrack, something big is happening and you want to have the sense of catastrophic vibration, you need some pressure level. So You're not in a big room, you're not going to get there from 4 small 10-inch subwoofers. You're just not. You need enough sound pressure level. I go back to the beginning, which is you need enough cone area to get there. It's just that when you're multiplying it to 4 subwoofers, you just need 4 smaller subwoofers than you would have needed theoretically for one big unit in the room. That's a good question. Where do they kick in? What frequency do you kick in? So in the olden days, before surround processors with subwoofer filters and bass management, which have been around for a long time now, that what I'm describing here has been around since 1995, 96. So this is not new. But in the olden days, the subwoofer would have a filter frequency, and you could actually take the signals from your preamplifier, run them through the subwoofer, produce a high pass filter at also either a selectable to the same frequency. So where's that frequency? So one approach, if you're not considering standing waves, which would be a big error, was just to say, well, my speakers play down to 40 hertz, my subwoofer's taking off from there. That was the original intention of subwoofers. But enter standing waves. So in the room I've been showing you, the standing wave started around 80 hertz. My recommendation is kick them in somewhere around 80 hertz. Even if the speakers can go below that, you've got major problems with standing waves that you're going to solve by using multiple subwoofers strategically located in tune. So let me share this. So I talked about a multi-point strategy to making this all good. And the first point was choose your subwoofer correctly and place it correctly. I hope I've beat that to death. The second one is choose the crossover location correctly. That's pretty quick. So you basically want the system you're playing with to sum all of the bass at a frequency that you've decided. I'll get to that in a second, and sum it all to the subwoofer. And that crossover is based on what's the What's the bass capability of your speakers and where the room needs the help from the subwoofer? So this is a block diagram of the subwoofer filter in a surround processor. Sometimes people call those AVRs, AVCs. I call them controllers, whether or not they have an amp in them. But you're normally going to sum all of the bass from all of the speakers together and feed them through a low pass filter to a subwoofer output, then assign that to multiple subwoofers. And the speakers are going to play a high pass filtered version of that, which means you're cutting off the bass at some frequency. So decision on that is basically determining what your speakers can do again and what the room is capable of doing. So first of all, what your speakers can do. I have read so many brochures from manufacturers that say, oh, this speaker extends all the way down to 30 hertz. Great. And then you measure it by doing the same measurement I just did, which we just take the speaker, put a microphone right in the cone, preferably outside, at a moderate level, just playing 70 or 80 dB, and you realize the speaker dies out below 70 hertz. What are they saying it goes down to 40 or 30? And you read the fine print, and it either tells you bandwidth, which just means it has some sound, or if you read carefully, it says that's the minus 10 dB point. So it's saying, I can play sound at 200 to 100 hertz, actually in your direction, and then there's still sound at 40 dB, but at 40 hertz, but it's 10 dB down. That's useless. That means it's basically gone. I want to know where the 3 dB down point is. And on a lot of speakers, that's 70, 80 hertz. You can do this. REW, a simple little microphone, measure your own speakers or look at data from some of the websites where they were measuring these things, and they'll tell you, but don't only do it at low level. Some speakers can play down to 40 hertz at low level, but when you crank them up, when you need the impact, the dynamics, the woofers are running out of steam. They're either going into power compression if it's an active speaker, the amplifier's clipping, or you're dangerously damaging your woofer to where the woofer of the speaker to where it could actually fail. So you need to check it at different levels. Observe the distortion. Listen whether it's going, just overloading. Generally, you want to choose from the speaker alone. This is disregarding standing waves in the room. Choose a crossover frequency that's where the speaker is down 3 dB from the main pass band. This is an example of a speaker I was measuring. It shows that somewhere around 80 hertz, this thing is down 2 to 3 dB. This speaker should be crossover at 80 hertz, whether or not there are standing waves. Then the next thing is, so one factor again is how low can the speaker go? Second factor is what's the room doing to you? Clearly in this room, there are problems. What's called the modal region, the standing wave region. Clearly to me, below 80 hertz, things are getting kind of ugly, where you see these big differences. Yeah. So if you're using an 80 hertz speaker, a speaker that can play down to 80 hertz in your measurement in a room like this, cross it over at 80. It's that simple. Sometimes a room is good down to 60 because it's a big room or has very floppy walls. It's an open floor plan that goes into the kitchen and the hallway, and there's no standing waves because they're all just dispersing. Whatever it is, you do some quick measurements and you'll find out. On average, 80 hertz is a good starting point. Most speakers can play down that much, and most rooms become modal, start to have serious standing waves somewhere around that frequency. And from that point on, you're going to tune the level of the subwoofer and the delay and other factors in that process. So, Brett, I'm going to continue on here and talk about the tuning. So Absolutely. Now you're in the point. Just to summarize on all this is you got a room, you've decided to spring for 4 subwoofers, 4 smaller ones, 4 12s or 4 10s if your room is not that big. You've placed them in the 4 corners. You've decided you're going to cross them over at 80 or 85 or 90, wherever is right. Are you done? Well, you could be. You've gotten a lot better than you were before, or than where you would be if you hadn't done any kind of bass management. But there's one more thing you can do with optimization. So to do this right, ideally, you want to measure, just as a quick primer on this, you don't want to just measure one location. You want to measure a few locations around the listening area. The main seat where you may sit, but maybe a seat to the right, a seat to the left, maybe behind and front, wherever there's going to be seats, or just get an average of the room with 4 microphone locations. If you're really classy about this, you buy 4 microphones and you buy a switcher that actually, in the case of REW, you can pay a little extra amount of money and it'll give you the ability to switch between the 4 mics. And you got to have an analyzer. I'm going to keep going back to this. If you want to do good work with this, you got to have at least one good USB or regular XLR microphone with an external converter that you can buy from Parts Express or one of the other vendors, and an analyzer. And again, my recommendation is REW. And the first thing you're going to do in the tuning process is inter-subwoofer delays. Then you're going to do the inter-subwoofer levels. So see what happens as you change the levels between the subs. And then you're going to EQ those 4 subwoofers as a group. To me, it's wrong to measure and equalize one subwoofer for flat and another one for flat, another one for flat, another one for flat, because when you group them back together, the response is going to be completely different. You first want to optimize how they work with each other and then tune the group. Here's the first step. You take the subwoofer output of your surround processor, typically a line level, either RCA or XLR. You plug it into a DSP equalizer, for 1 in, 4 out. That equalizer needs to be able to tune frequency response, but also set delays differently. And the mini DSP box, which is a few $100, or this thing that you can get from Parts Express under the Dayton Audio brand, which is called the 4X8 or 408 or 4X8. I guess 408. EQ is 4 input, 8 output. You only need 1 input to 4 output. That thing's under $200. Works great. So you are going to feed your 4 subwoofers equally. You're going to feed them all either, I recommend at this point just doing pink PN, which is pseudo-random pink noise, and you're going to measure the results. And you're going to look at what happens as you change the delay between the subwoofers. I usually start by delaying the back subwoofers 2 milliseconds, then 4 milliseconds, then 6 milliseconds, then 8 milliseconds, and observe the result. Then go back to 0 and then delay the fronts 2 milliseconds at a time. And then delay the 2 lefts, delay the 2 rights. By that point, you'll get a pretty good sense with what the room is doing with your subwoofers. You can also try delaying a single subwoofer. Just go, I'm going to leave 3 subwoofers at 0 milliseconds. I'm going to delay the front left by 2, 4, 8, 10 milliseconds, observe the results. The really cool thing with Room EQ Wizard is every setting you can save. And you save it in a memory slot and you look at the results. Ultimately, what you're looking for is the result that is the loudest and the least variation from seat to seat. So you're looking for overall gain and smoothness and evenness throughout the room. Remember this is this listening room with single subwoofer at a single microphone location, 38 dB error. This is the same listening room with 4 subwoofers without any optimization. They're all 4 of them are driven together. And the average of 4 microphone measurements is the red line. Not bad. And this is after running MSO. Here's the result as measured at the 4 microphones. So what you're looking for is a smoother result, which actually the green and brown curves look really nice and smooth. Those are at 2 of the microphone locations. And then the red and blue are 2 other microphone locations. That's not okay. So at some microphone locations, this scheme improved things substantially in terms of making a really smooth result from 22 hertz up to 150, 200 hertz. And at other seats, it wasn't good. Okay, that's where you pause and you go, I'm trying to get less variation from seat to seat and good overall response. So now I go manual and I do the same thing with just manual adjustments, that thing I said, which is trying to delay here, delay there, advance here, change levels. And these are 4 microphone averages. I have the curves for the individuals. I'm not showing them here, but this mustard color here is the original result with no optimization, no manual optimization. And the green curve is the result with manual optimization. And we've reduced the errors from 20 dB to 7 dB peak to peak. Which one of these 2 is better? So this is with no optimization. This is with optimization. They're both not right. This one is better. Why? Because what we're going to do to this is we're going to apply some equalization here to turn down this peak. And this peak is at 36 hertz. 36 hertz gets to be into those low frequencies where it's hard for the cones to push bass. And we've now gained at 36 hertz, we've gained 6 dB of sensitivity out of the thing. It's more efficient. And all we do now is we turn that down with one band of parametric EQ, not hard to do inside the equalizer. And we got ourselves 6 dB more headroom at 36 hertz than pre-optimization.
Gotcha.
So what I'm looking for on all this is smoothness of response, overall gain, overall efficiency, and less variation from seat to seat. Here's another room, different optimization routines. Let me start with the red. The red is 4 subwoofers, no EQ, no delay. That's what we start with. In green is apply delay. Look at what happened here. We got ourselves 12 dB more energy at 67 hertz. That's substantial. And then what we're going to do is we're going to sit on this peak. We're going to turn it down. This is part of the way there. So in blue is as we're equalizing it back down to get to a smooth response. 12 dB more. That's, I think, the best case I've ever seen. So we're going to add an EQ. We're going to smooth that out. Here's another room in, before and after EQ, before delay. So no delay is in red. We got a peak here at 42 hertz. We add delay, in this case, I don't know, 6 milliseconds of delay somewhere, and we get ourselves a lot more energy at 23 hertz, 6 dB more. That's 4 times the power to play the bottom octave. And then then we apply equalization to smooth out this green curve, and we end up with a nice smooth response that fits in a 2 dB window. All that for a few $100s. And the list goes on. I've got lots of examples of that. In this room, we got 6 dB more at 30 hertz by just applying delay, and then we equalize it out. In this other room, we added 8 milliseconds of delay, and we got 12 dB of overall gain over, the region from 40 hertz to 80 hertz. Unbelievable. This room went from having puny bass, nothing, no impact, kablamo, using a series of small 8-inch woofers in a pretty big room. Interestingly enough, this is the progression in that room as you went in 2 milliseconds of delay. I forget if it was the front or the back. This is back, where this was the original 2, 4, 6, 8, etc. So that's kind of a cool progression. So I talked about delay, but also you want to do the inter-subwoofer levels to do the same thing. And then you equalize the whole result in one go, and you end up with stellar bass. You set the overall level so that it matches your speakers, maybe a little hotter than the mid-range, and you get that bass that everybody's looking for. It's very cool.
Well, very cool. So I know we were talking about seating locations a little bit earlier. We've now put subs into different areas. Are there better places to sit? How do you look at that when you're designing a room, Anthony?
So we talked earlier about how, hey, there's standing wave peaks and nulls, and you were saying, oh my God, there's nowhere I can sit in here. It's like, well, there kind of is. If you did nothing with a subwoofer placement, at least you could sit at a place where there's no big peaks or nulls. But then you can, if you're just using one subwoofer, you can move it to where it's less bad and then choose your seating location. And sometimes just moving it 6 inches is all it takes to get out of a big peak or a null. You're going to know it by listening to it, but even better by just putting a microphone there and moving it around. So just like you move the subwoofer around, you also maybe move the microphone around and see what happens as you move left to right, front to back. Is there a place where suddenly the bass gets good? Remember, that's just one seat location. I'm going to show you some kind of simple guidelines for what we like to look at. So let me share my screen again. Oh, by the way, before I forget, this is the same room that was red originally. We repainted it. It's blue now with the 4 subwoofers. This is in its current state. If you came to our office and looked at it, this is what you would see. This is an acoustically transparent screen. There's a left, there's a center, and a right speaker. We also make speakers that can go above and below the screen, so if you want to hear what that sounds like. But there's 2 of the subwoofers in the front. These are relatively skinny subwoofers with a 13-inch super thin subwoofer. Is there a picture of the back? Oh, there's a picture showing all the microphones set up for these tests. 1, 2, 3, 4. The bass guitar I no longer play. Anyway, so in the seating locations, you don't want to sit here. You don't want to sit there. You don't want to sit there. You don't want to sit at the nulls. You don't want to sit at the peaks. But check it out. If you look at all of those peaks and dips, and you look at places where you're at neither a peak or a dip, look at this dotted line over here. If you sit here, which is 0.2 of the length of the room, right up against the speakers, which I don't recommend doing if your speakers are here, it's too close. But if you sit back 80% of the room, you're neither at a deep null nor at a big peak. I don't usually like the sound, 80% of the way back in the room, but if you want to be that far, you can. Another one is at 0.68 of the room. If you sit here, you're not at a null, You're not at a big peak. You're a bit of a peak over here, but that's a good place. Somewhere right around here, 0.7, 0.68, or zero point 0.7. If you sit at 0.55 of the length of the room, you're neither at a big peak or null. If you sit at half of the room, it's going to suck. If you sit at 0.45, it's pretty good. If you sit at 0.32. So what I like to do in the beginning of setting up a room is look at the length of the room, look at the width, and try to put seat locations at 0.32, 0.55, 0.5, 0.32, 0.45, 55, 0.68, or 0.8 of the room as a start point. And then measure it, because some rooms are going to behave slightly differently to that. Here's a little chart that shows the same thing on all three axes, front to back, left to right, and top to bottom. So top to bottom is important too. Standing waves don't just happen in this direction, they also happen in this direction. And I've worked on plenty of rooms where right at the seat position, there's a giant null. And sometimes all it takes is to build a little platform that you sit on to get yourself out of the null. That platform may as well be perforated or slotted and turn into a bit of a bass trap too.
You brought up bass traps in there, Anthony. We built this room, we put in subs, we've got some general guidelines as to where we're putting our seating. What do we look at for bass damping? What do we look at for bass traps?
So remember in the beginning of this, I talked about these waves bouncing back and forth freely. We talked about how to reduce their drive by using multiple subwoofers or putting them in the way, basically putting them in the way of the standing wave. We talked about not sitting where the nulls are. We talked about tuning it out. But what if you did something in the room so the sound doesn't bounce back and forth in the bass? And that's the domain of bass damping, bass absorption. People say that they're going to implement a bass trap or they're going to buy a bass track, and there's a giant caveat emptor. A lot of companies build things and sell them as bass traps. They aren't bass traps at all. They're chunks of foam you put in the corner that absorb 200 hertz and nothing below that. They're not getting rid of standing waves. And that's unless your room is only like 10 feet by 11 feet or smaller. Standing waves are mainly in the 60 to 80 hertz region, which means that you got to have really big devices if they're going to be foam. That doesn't really work. You do want some kind of bass damping. So if we can do something so the bass doesn't roll freely back and forth in the room, it's worth it. So let me talk about bass damping rather than bass traps. I just think of it as damping, and it's not dampening. Dampening is the act of putting water on something. Damping is reducing the oscillation. So one approach would be to do bass absorption using fiberglass, foam, recycled jeans, something fibrous, something that offers resistance to the free flow of waves and scrubs it off through friction. For it to work at 60 hertz or 70 hertz, it's going to have to be really thick, like 4, 5, 6 feet thick. It's just not practical. So in order to get rid of, like if we pretended we're talking about our 20-foot room, 6 meters, where you have a null, you're going to need to have an absorber that's an eighth of the way into the room, which is 76 centimeters thick. That's big. Okay. That's about, 2.5 feet, 3 feet big. It's not practical. It works, but it's not practical. So you can also put, instead of a big chunk, you can put an absorber panel right at the null. That works also. It's still not very practical. It does work. You can put them in the corners. You can take absorber panels and put them in the corners so that there's some air gap behind it. It works okay. It'll work down to 70, maybe sometimes 60 hertz. If the panel is big enough, it can work, but it can't be just thin foam that's lightweight. It has to be a pretty heavy duty material for it to work. And I get calls and emails all the time from like, hey, I have terrible problems in my bass. I bought this bass trap and it hasn't changed anything. I measured it, I listened to it. What's going on? Well, you just bought this little chunk of foam that you stuck in the corner that's too thin. The bass waves are just hitting it and laughing at it and going back around. It's like driving over a coin with your car. You don't even know it's there. You need things that are more substantial. So when you're talking about more substantial, one thing that people either buy or build is diaphragm absorbers, which are giant drum heads, like just a giant frame with either plywood or some other resonant material that you can calculate by looking at some equations you can find on the internet. It's a bit complicated to build. If you're using wood, it will be unreliable because the plywood layer will change its density and its flexure with humidity and temperature. So we've done these many times before and notice they change day by day. It's not it's not the right way to build a room. So if you're going to do those, use a flexural membrane that's not porous or not sensitive to humidity. Another way you can do bass damping is what's called Helmholtz absorbers, which are resonators using kind of a wine bottle effect, where at one frequency, the sound goes through the neck of the box and it loses energy through friction. That can work pretty well. These boxes are big. There's people who make them. You can build them yourself. You can find internet equations, but they need to be really big for the frequencies we're talking about, which is 60 to 80 hertz. You know, like they're giant coffin-sized things with big holes. Not very practical. More practical is actually the intersection of the two above, which is a frame up about 4 to 5 inches deep, so around 10 to 15 centimeters deep, that has a perforated panel and has a little bit of absorption inside. And now you're combining a flexural panel with a Helmholtz absorber all in one. That can work pretty well and doesn't take a lot of depth. You do need to still need to have pretty big surface area. There are equations on the internet. I'm not going to go there. If you're interested in doing that, look it up. Just look up perforated absorber panel or something like that. You can also buy them from some manufacturers. Or if you're building a room from scratch, you can actually intentionally build damped walls. So instead of having a really stiff wall that the standing wave bounces back and forth from, if you build it out of these rubber isolators, there's a few different models out there where the sheetrock is mounted on this rubber isolator, maybe with a little backing of plywood. Then when the wave hits it, the sheetrock actually moves. The gypsum board, I should call it. Sheetrock is a brand. It moves a little bit, and every time it moves, it dissipates a little bit of energy. It changes the phase of what rotates back, and it will dissipate your standing waves a lot. So I'm a big fan of using either this thing called the PAC, which is Pacific International RSIC1, which is a clip you put onto the studs and looks like this. So here's your stud. You screw the clip into there. You put a piece of hat channel and put your sheetrock on there. Or there's a model from Kinetics Noise Control that is same kind of result. It's a block like this that you put a hat channel into. You screw the sheetrock through the hat channel using sheet metal sheetrock screws. Does the same thing. But the main thing is you now have, let me go back to this drawing, you now have walls that are damped, that actually can flex a little bit. And you have an added bonus, which is you now built a room that's sound isolated, because instead of the sound transmitting to the studs and out to the neighboring room, it's contained in the room. So if you're building from scratch, you can just build a room with these sound isolation clips and you'll result in way better standing wave characteristics, way better. Just to go back to it, a bunch of people make bass traps. Caveat emptor, which means buyer beware in Latin. They speak that in Latin America. No, they don't. Maybe they do, some people. And so how are you beware? Well, if you spend a bunch of money on somebody's bass traps, ask for the data. Make sure the data doesn't look like a chart that they just drew on the back of a napkin, but it actually comes from a laboratory. And make sure it's effective down to 40 hertz. And there's no two ways about it. The good stuff is going to cost more. If it's cheap, it probably works that well, which is no good. So solutions are either good bass absorbers that work clearly down to 40, 45 hertz. They're usually big, they're expensive. Hey, if this audio thing matters to you, you're going to spend the money on it. Don't spend the money on really expensive wires. That's not going to change your bass response. Spend it on good bass traps. Or if you can, build a room or tear down your sheetrock if the room's already built, put these isolators in. It's going to cost some money, but the improvement on sound isolation and on bass response is substantial. Well worth it.
David was asking, and this kind of fits into, golden ratios and looking at room design. So what about non-rectangular rooms, trapezoidal walls? What are your thoughts as you're designing and building a room in there, Anthony, and how that relates to bass management?
So room dimensions are a big conversation around standing waves, and they're extremely complicated and confusing. And I will say that trapezoidal rooms don't help. They change things and they don't help. So let me share my screen again and show you some data. So room dimensions are critical in a way in standing waves because the resonance between the front and back and the left and right are going to be there. What you want ideally is not to have the same resonances from the front to the back, the left to the right, and the top to the bottom. So if you built a cubic concrete room, that would be a disaster, except for one fact, which is interesting. But if you built a cubic room that's like 20 foot by 20 foot by 20 foot, all solid concrete that resonates exactly at the frequencies you expect, you're going to end up with standing waves that are all at exactly the same frequency. And that's going to be horrible. It's going to be a triple whammy. What you want to do is to build a room in which the resonances from front to back are at different frequencies than left to right and different frequencies than top to bottom. And so you can predict that. You think you can predict it, actually. The accepted thing is to avoid a condition where you have a resonance along the length and along the width that are at the same frequency or close to that. So you can calculate it, calculate the resonances by using this equation. This is basically the speed of sound in feet divided by 2 times the distance, either front to back, left to right, top to bottom. And here it is in meter. N being 1 is the first resonance, 2 is a second, or first harmonic, second harmonic, third, fourth. You don't really need to calculate past fourth. And what you're really interested in is the region of the room where it is modal. Now, here's an interesting thing for you total geeks. You can figure out, based on the size of the room, the range in which you're going to have standing waves by this equation. This below F1, which is 172 times the length, or 565 times the length, depending on whether you're in meters or feet, is going to be pretty much the region below which there aren't standing waves to worry about. F2, which is the highest frequency, you can calculate by this equation, depending on whether you're in metric or in imperial. And there it is. So you can do all of that. Caveat mTOR again here, or calculator mTOR. Here's an interesting thing. Let me go forward. There's a lot of really cool geeky info, but I want to bring this up. F. Alton Everest, very well-known acoustician, said that predicting modal response with certainty is very difficult. Working from general guidelines and recommendations, the modal response of each room must be considered on a case-by-case basis. That's scientific speak for going, it's not so easy. This guy's very smart. If you guys want to pick up one book and read about room acoustics, read the Handbook of Acoustics by F. Alton Everest. This guy is excellent. My son's middle name is Alton, partially after him. Remember, we had a big problem. Let me go back. In the actual measurements in the room, we have a problem at 38, a problem at 50, and then there's also a problem at 72 over here. And then you look at the predictions, and none of that is there. There's one prediction at 71.2 on the length. It's a second harmonic of the length, which actually at the microphone location should have resulted in a dip, not a peak. This is really frustrating. I have this giant Excel spreadsheet that can calculate it, and it doesn't work. Why? Because this room is built out of sheetrock on studs, gypsum board on studs. So at those low frequencies, it bends around differently on the left wall, the right wall, the front wall, back wall. Non-symmetrically, there's a door here and a door there that are at slightly different positions. So this whole calculation thing that people are doing from calculators on the internet, Excel spreadsheets, if you're not in a concrete box, it's not relevant. You really want to measure it. How do you measure it? Room EQ Wizard, give them $50 or $100, buy a microphone, you got a great tool. Now, the second part of this question is, what about rooms that are non-symmetrical? Doesn't get rid of things. I've built plenty of these. I've been in plenty of those. I measure the standing waves. They're equally bad, but they're not predictable. So it doesn't get rid of standing waves. There still are resonances. This shape that I call the coffin box, it complicates the acoustic modeling calculations. It doesn't get rid of standing waves. It just moves them. And the standing wave lines, instead of being along predictable left to right or front to back ranges, start to bend around. Don't believe me. My buddy F. Alton Everest has this in his book. Here's a comparison of a rectangular space playing a first harmonic at 34 hertz along the width, where there's a nice null along the whole ridge from front to back. It's 100% here, minus 100% there, 100 dB. Its polarity is flipped, and here there's 0. You take that same room size, and you bend it. Here's the standing waves. There's still a standing wave. It's still 100 here. It's 70 there, 40 there. So maybe you could say, well, it's not as loud as in that corner. Well, nobody's sitting in that corner. There's still a null along here. It's just unpredictable. Didn't get rid of it. It just made it harder to figure out where it's going to be.
But at least with a rectangular room, the walls aren't working against you as well and creating additional issues. The line is basically straight. Whereas when you start getting into trapezoidal rooms and other non-parallel rooms, you're just adding more and more complexity to it that you still have to end up working out anyways.
You still need to do something. So this is the first harmonic along the width and the third harmonic along the length, where it shows, I don't know if you can see it, there's a ridge over here and then ridge, ridge, ridge. That's a third harmonic. Rectangular, this is what it looks like. Whatever you want to call this, non-rectangular, non-parallelepiped. There still are problems. They're just in a different place. You can say that the ridges are less steep, but there's still problems. And Murphy's first law of acoustics is you're going to put the mix position right here where there's a null.
Yeah.
And you're going to put the producer's couch right here where there's also a null. This goes on. This is all in his book. Here's the third harmonic just lengthwise. You can see there's ridges over here. There's still ridges over there. It doesn't really help. It's more complicated to build. It's really hard to make the non-square corners have good sound isolation. It's hard to join them to where the sound doesn't leak out. You're losing real estate because in many cases, those other areas are just voided. It just doesn't help. My view of it is you want to take control of those standing waves and you want to do everything. The room sizing, yes, you want to put the seats at the right locations. You want to place the subwoofers, do multiples at the right location. You want to do some damping, absorption, and equalization. And if you do all 6 of these things, I'm running out of fingers over here, then you run a chance of getting that nice, tight, punch, even bass that's smoother and with better transient and less deviation across the seats. You have to think of all those. Smoother bass, louder, punchier bass, and also less change from seat to seat. Whether you're in a 2-channel listening room where you want to have some friends over listening with you, if you're in a recording studio where you want across the mixing console, you don't want to have big changes, or you don't want the producer in the back hearing something completely different than you, or whether you're in a theater or home cinema where you want all of the seats to have a consistent experience, you got to do all this. And I call bass management the process of controlling all of this, not just one thing. So I'm putting up our contact info. Brett, I'm sure you're putting it up there too. If there's any questions, you can email info@grimanisystems.com. Our websites are grimanisystems.com or PMI Ltd.
While there's tools that are getting better and better, like Dirac Live and tools from Trinov and other brands, that's great. And it's better than not having anything. As much as those tools are there, you still want that manual calibration at the end. It's that ear at the end of it because people are listening. It's not just a computer. You're going to have multiple seats going in there. So you want to make sure that you're getting as even as a sound response as you can across all those seats, not just the captain's chair, because we're usually not in a 2-channel single chair listening environment. We've got a few last questions in here, Anthony.
Let me pause.
Yeah,
we're 2 hours into this, and I have to thank you guys that are listening in for your endurance here. This is amazing. You're still here. Thank you very much.
It is. We got 40 people on the line. We still got some questions coming in. I have a feeling it's slowing down, so hopefully we'll try to knock everybody out in the last couple of moments here. Asking about using seat risers as big bass absorption. We talked about that a little bit, but if you have any final thoughts on that.
Well, so I mentioned that, in the thing about bass damping, that you can put diaphragm absorbers, they don't work very well. You can put ported absorbers, they don't work very well, but you can do the combination, which is, holes inside a box. Well, that box is your riser and it's tall. It's going to be at least 6 inches usually doesn't provide enough of a riser for headroom. Usually it's 8 to 12 to 14, which is, 20, 25 centimeters. But if you use that box with the right perforation on the top, don't perforate the whole thing. You got to calculate what are the size of the holes and the distances between them based on your standing wave region in your room. And you put a bit of insulation inside. Don't overpack it. Then it'll stop being a low frequency absorber. Put a little bit in there. You will essentially, I'm going to say almost free, you end up with a wonderful big bass absorber that'll get rid of a huge amount of this trouble.
That makes perfect sense. So I'm going to combine a few questions. So Aubrey and Tony were asking, so if you're putting in, let's say, dual subs, if one is out of phase with the other, what's happening? And then in Tony's question, if you were using 2 subwoofers, not 4, is there an advantage to using opposite corners? Because I know you like corner placement.
So in phase or out of phase is a really interesting question. Trial and error. That's part of the trial and error. I didn't mention it. I usually find that, 2 or 3 or 4 subwoofers just delay is enough to introduce phase shifts between the subwoofer and the standing waves that it fixes it. But once in a while, putting one of the subwoofers completely phase polarity flipped resolves everything. You will lose, potentially at some frequencies, you'll lose efficiency, but with the benefit of better response. Trial and error, try it. And if you're using one of those DSP gizmos, there's always a polarity button in there. They call it phase, they shouldn't. They should call it polarity. And just try it and see, hey, did I get smoother response at all the seat locations or not? And sometimes it does help. So that was one of them. The other one is with 2 subwoofers doing the 2 corners. Well, so if you look through Todd Welty's trial and error attempts or his simulations, that is not as good as putting them front and back, middle of the room, or middle of the left and right. It's still better than putting them both up front. There's a grade for that. You can read through the whole paper. Try it. And that's what I always say is just go ahead and try it. If it works well being that you don't get these wild variations in the response and wild changes from seat to seat, it works. Keep in mind that unless you're in concrete or concrete block construction, the waves are hitting walls that are all bouncing and working in different ways, like they do in our room over here. And so you never really know. You know, you like to think things in orderly, clean ways, but the walls are not. They're not clean. They're reflecting differently. So sometimes maybe offsetting them to the left and right of the center line is going to end up with a better result. Your answer is time and a dolly.
There you go. There you go. Well, and that follows into what you were showing before on the graphs, where adding 2-millisecond delays and things like that, not just based on distance, but you could see where you were actually creating gains that you could then bring down to give headroom, right? Just goes to show you guys, it's not here's a calculator and be done with it. There is a lot of trial and error in there. And if you need help with it, there are great people like Anthony that are out there willing and ready to help you guys out with your theater designs, because it's a big investment for clients. And we see people do a theater one time, and when they go to the next house, they don't do one. And a lot of that comes into things like this, where we're just putting speakers in, we're putting screens in, we're going as big as we can, but that room just doesn't sound right. Whereas if it's done right and we spend the time damping rooms properly, building rooms properly, adding subwoofers in a way that really reflects on the room, people are going to love those rooms. They're going to recommend you more. They're going to bring you into more jobs, and they're going to bring you in when they move into the next one. So any final thoughts in there, Anthony, as we kind of close this out? It looks like we got all the questions answered. So thank you guys again for everybody that hung on.
Yeah, my final thoughts is exactly what you said. Thanks for listening to this whole thing for 2.25 hours. And bass is important and it's difficult. And our company focuses on that, whether we're doing engineering work to help design these things or tune them, or whether we're building speakers for them. All include 4 subwoofers. And people go, why do these things have 4 subwoofers? And now I can say, watch the webinar. And it's just because if you don't do that, it's really hard to get decent bass.
In addition to the video, which everybody will get, we also have the 5-part article. So again, give that a read through. It's a great article that Anthony spent a lot of time writing. And so we wanted to be able to give it to you guys. I think next time we will probably be looking at something like AES 67, got to talk a little networked audio. And we may have some additional special guests. Make sure you guys keep an eye out for any emails coming from Anthony, and we'll talk to you guys soon.
Sayonara.
Bye, everybody.